One of the reasons we call this Where Kids Meet the Street is this is where we're most vulnerable, and especially children when we're walking to school with them or letting them walk to school. My work, I'm based in Boise, is in private consulting, and have been doing active transportation work to some degree for more than a decade, maybe 15 years now. And so what they asked me to do today is go over things like intersection and crossing treatments, because that's really where the exposure is. And as you can see from this image from down under, kids see roads differently. And one of the things we're starting to find is our traffic laws, especially for pedestrians, aren't intuitive. And we really haven't updated them in 100 years. And in many ways, we don't design roads to account for what we ask pedestrians to do. And so we think and we see from the national research, the rise we've seen in pedestrian fatalities, especially over the last 10 years, is starting to be compounded by these issues. So we wanted to go over some of the tools that you can have. We must do better than this. These are all school area crossings in Idaho. The top left is here's a flag that you probably can't reach and a crosswalk that's faded away. On the right, a high-speed US highway where we've only given kids a flag to cross, we've put the pedestrian sign so far to the right and out of the driver's field of spectrum. We have daylight and nighttime, or daytime and nighttime hour issues across the state, and some parts where kids are going to school in the dark. So lighting and crosswalk visibility is an issue. And then the bottom left doesn't do the road the full justice. This road you could probably have the Titanic make a U-turn on. And again, while we've given some flashers, this road in no way justifies the 4 lanes of traffic that's there. I think it gets about 2,000 vehicles a day. So we have to really rethink what we're doing. And in Idaho, this is seen in our crash data where a pedestrian or bicyclist is seriously injured or killed every 3 days. And this number is going the wrong way. This used to be every 5 days. So we're starting to see a lot of issues with this. And one of the things we often hear, and if you've gotten a traffic safety grant or something, we'll hear this mantra about safety is a shared responsibility. And if we're doing that, we're reflecting the lobbying by the auto industry of 100 years ago to spread the wealth, so to speak. And let's just look at this. This is a image I say, cross here, kids. The signal says walk. Well, let's look at this idea of shared responsibility. I'm driving that truck there. I probably have a minimum weight of 4,500 pounds. I'm probably up to 6,000 or 7,000. Now, I produce a lot of energy at only 20 miles an hour. A pickup truck like this produces a lot more energy than a Prius moving at the same speed. The public operation of that vehicle is a privilege. The public operation of those kids is a right. Our roads and traffic signals undergo detailed, very detailed design elements and signal timing for the exclusive comfort of that vehicle. Yet many of our roads are purposely designed to limit the freedom of mobility of those children. And when we do give children traffic signals, oftentimes we default to the minimum timing that's on those. And by the way, with this Idaho special pickup truck here on the left, we have legal modifications that can raise the profile of that vehicle. So instead of the Prius hitting myself or my daughter in the knees or the legs, it's hitting us in the vital organs or the head. And so when I hear shared responsibility, I say that's not a valid expectation of people who walk and bike until they are given equal consideration in road design and equal opportunity to move safely throughout the system. That's when we can share it. We often hear things like make eye contact. And if you've ever tried to actually do that with the A-pillars on a vehicle, with the tinting, with window glare, and then vehicles of this size, you'll realize that's not a fair expectation to give a child at an unmarked, unsignalized crossing where they might be walking to school. Speed is also an issue. We've seen traffic deaths go up during COVID because essentially it's revealed how our roads are designed to induce speed. And we start talking about the limitations on a human body, especially a child. The research is really telling us that that 10-mile-an-hour difference is really 7 times more likely to kill a child. So this is why these components are important, and that's what we're going to give you today. But I think we need to first bust some myths that I've seen over my career that limit our ability to put engineering countermeasures into the system. And I'm going to bust those shortly. I do a whole hour-long presentation called Everything Your Traffic Safety Office Told You Is Wrong to help bust down these things so we can make streets safer. One is this idea of, well, kids need to know the law. And as I said, our laws are very counterintuitive. This is research from the Transportation Research Board looking at pedestrian safety at unsignalized crossings. And this is the characteristics they put in that research report of different pedestrian groups. Young children have limited peripheral vision and sound source not located easily. They have very poor gap speed assessment when it comes to judging oncoming vehicles. And they have things like they want to run, they want to dart, which oftentimes we hear as an excuse in a pedestrian crash for not charging the motorist of anything. They want to limit their crossing time. As we get older, preteens, they walk across more risky roads because of where we place our schools. And they're willing to take chances because that's how their bodies are programmed and the chemistry that's there. High school age kids feel invincible and will overestimate their abilities. And the more you look at the younger age spectrum here, the more they start to have very similar physical and cognitive limitations as people with certain types of disabilities. And so this idea of training them to know the law in many cases is not always possible from just a natural ability standpoint. And that's not to say something like education isn't desirable and has its purpose, but we need to understand these limitations when designing our system. Another thing we'll hear is, oh, we follow AASHTO standards and that's why we can't do X, Y, or Z. Little hint for you, there is no such thing as AASHTO standards. The AASHTO Green Book, which is this document in front of you, is about 1,000 pages long. It has a lot of things on the design of streets. And if you ask any attorney, something that's standard is compulsory or required. And that usually comes with the word shall. Luckily, I have a 1,000-page PDF version of the Green Book, and I can search in a couple of minutes, and you will not find the word shall in there at all. Oftentimes, it's our cities, our highway districts, or our state DOTs that adopt standards. The Green Book itself has a lot of flexibility in it that should be incorporated into our local standards if we go back and revisit them. AASHTO even publishes its own flexibility guide to say how flexible they are in the design. The Green Book is not intended and never was intended to be used solely as the standard upon which to base the design of every highway, and there's sufficient flexibility permitted to encourage independent designs. But they also say in this book, and the case law backs it up, a standard doesn't make something safe. A standard will generally shield you from liability. However, deviating even from a local standard, like Idaho standards for public works construction, needs to be documented. And agencies don't get in trouble legally for not following a standard. They get in trouble legally when it's not followed and they don't document the reasons why. And so if you have a licensed engineer and they have that license, the judgment and the project tracking is generally seen as more important because they realize not a single document or book can account for every situation in which we're trying to make decisions. The other manual out there, the Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices, in some contrast to AASHTO, does have things that say shall and does have standards, but they even say up front that the MUTCD should not be considered a substitute for engineering judgment. And again, it's about a specific situation. If you go deep into that document, which is about another 1,000 pages, and they're updating it this year, there's a breakdown. Things that are standards will use the word shall and will be put in bold text. And chapter 4 of this covers, or excuse me, chapter 7 of this covers school zones, and there are other pedestrian and bicyclist elements. Much of this document is actually something other than a standard. A vast majority of the content are these guidance options and support. So if you were to thumb through MUTCD and hear somebody always call it a standard, very few, maybe 20% of the things in there are a standard. The other piece with MUTCD to understand is it oftentimes doesn't require something to happen. It means if you make the decision to install a sign, a pavement marking, a traffic control device, you then have to comply with the book. Level of service must be preserved. We can't allow the kids to cross. That'll delay vehicles, and that's against federal policy. Not true. Level of service for motorists is 100% a comfort measure. It is not a safety measure. This has been stated and validated by the Federal Highway Administration, but it gets interpreted as this sacred doctrine too many times. Cars have to go fast. That's what the policy says. AASHTO says failure to achieve a level of service indicated in the Green Book does not constitute a non-standard design decision, and FHWA has clarified it's not a mandate. The funny part about it is the moment we realize it's not required, we can then also realize that Federal Highway Administration has published guidance on level of service for pedestrians. And many of our traffic highway capacity manual softwares have pedestrian and bicyclist level of service modules in them, and we should be using those as a trade-off and understanding when we evaluate new developments, corridor studies, and intersections. And what FHWA says is when a pedestrian starts to experience more than 40 seconds of delay at a signalized intersection, their likelihood of non-compliance is high or very high. That's that classic, sometimes misunderstood jaywalking. I'm going to cross against the signal if I think it's clear, if you make me wait more than 40 or 60 seconds for that. And we need to consider those things in this realm. Lane widths are another one. If you're a local city and you have local residential streets that still have 12-foot lane widths as a requirement, you've got lane widths that are as wide as some interstate highways. And we know those kind of factors with other street design elements help prompt speed. This is a great point to show how AASHTO isn't a standard, because 12-foot lanes are not a standard unless your local agency adopts them. The AASHTO Green Book has 9 to 12-foot lanes for local and collector streets and 10 to 12-foot lanes for urban arterials. And they explicitly say there is less direct evidence of a safety benefit associated with incrementally wider lanes in urban areas, and the values for lower speed urban street lane widths are less rigorously devised. This is because AASHTO is a national organization of state DOTs. They're looking at state highways, and I love the photo on the bottom left because that is a 10-foot travel lane in McCall, Idaho on a state highway, and it gets a lot of truck, recreational, and boat traffic there. So we do have flexibility to do these kind of things. Last myth before we move into the treatments, 94% of crashes are caused by human error. I call this the golden calf of traffic safety, and I've heard it unfortunately used a lot over my time to deny a safety countermeasure. Well, if the pedestrians were just perfect, or if the motorists were just perfect, our standard following design practice wouldn't be a problem. Well, that's not what the data says. This stat is oftentimes misquoted from the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration's crash causation study, where they looked at the critical pre-crash event and found that the last failure in the causal chaining of events leading up to a crash was related to driver error. But the causal chain of events represents many, many things, including the road conditions and the road design that's out there. So moving into the main topic today, as we set that standard, I'm going to kind of do this from a menu perspective. I'm going to give you the appetizers first, some of the basics, and then we're going to move into the entrees when we look at signals. And I've just called this one dessert of other great things you can incorporate into this environment. And if we put these things all together, we kind of get that wholesome meal that we are looking for. So let's start with crossing and crosswalks. This is the AASHTO guide for pedestrian facilities. And 2 points I'll point out here is we must assume that pedestrians want and need safe access to all destinations that are accessible to motorists out there. You can even see in many of our design practices, we don't do that. Frequency. This is important. Pedestrians must be able to cross streets at highways at regular intervals. Unlike motor vehicles, pedestrians cannot be expected to go a quarter mile or more out of their way to take advantage of a controlled intersection. And that's AASHTO using a word like must and cannot, and tend to look at that use of wording as much more important than some others about may or should statements, but that's why this is important. There are different types of crosswalks. Kind of show the top left of just these transverse lines. It's oftentimes considered the cheapest, but it's also the least effective and the least safe. And one thing we need to remember is crosswalks are really there mostly for the motorist benefit. In Idaho, every intersection is a legal crosswalk, whether one is marked. So we are raising the visibility of the crosswalk to the motorist. The other three you see are generally known as more high visibility crosswalks. And the bottom right, kind of this elephant print, is a way to help mimic the visibility of a high visibility crosswalk, but help lessen the cost exposure for agencies. And here's why this matters. Those two standard lines generally have about the same visibility to a motorist during the day and night, 200 feet. And this is from Federal Highway Administration research. The moment we move to either a continental or a ladder style crosswalk, you can see during the day, when a lot of kids are moving about, that gets up to 500 feet. And at night, it's a little over 300 feet, and very similar for the ladder style crosswalks. If you go to a state like California, they put high visibility but yellow paint markings to specially designate school crossings to drivers. Some other treats. Curb extensions or neck downs, and these are generally doable in areas with on-street parking in all types of environments. And this is basically to reduce the exposure a pedestrian has in crossing. And as you can see from the vision triangle here, from the motorist to the pedestrian on the right, increase the likelihood that they can see each other moving down the street. And if we just had a regular corner, a regular turn radius at this intersection, the red would show how long that is. Another one, and in general, pedestrian refuge islands have a lot of safety benefits where you have room to get them, usually with a center turn lane. But then this staggered or Z crossing is also one, particularly at mid-block crossings, and you'll see this in some roundabouts, that allow you to cross a stage at a time, turn, you get a view of traffic, and hopefully they view you and cross here. If you have shared use pathways that are crossing roads at mid-block locations, this is truly a design you should be using because it helps limit that going straight across here and puts it in a stage. The one thing I would avoid on this at signalized intersections is if we have a median, we need to not force the pedestrian to wait there for an extra 2 or 3 minutes. I can show you one on US 95 in North Idaho that is downright terrifying to stand out in that median. We need to give people time to cross in one phase. So here's some different curb extensions, and I've tried to use photos from around Idaho so you have context, or maybe if you see a place that you're familiar with, they can give you what they've experienced here. Chubbuck, Idaho has retrofitted like some classic 1970s, 1960s style roadways with these curb extensions. They help make the radius, the turning radius for motorists tighter, and have all those other benefits for pedestrians. The other three are ones that also allow us to treat the drainage flows that existed prior to the curb extension. Oftentimes we'll hear that the drainage issues, which are valid, can be used to basically prohibit that. But I wanted to show you that there are other options. This 27th Street one in Boise has an added feature, and you can kind of see the tire marks on it. It is built like an apron of a roundabout, so it can be mountable to the lower percentage of truck traffic that is there, but forces the vast majority of regular vehicle traffic to take that turn a lot slower and has some of the same benefits for pedestrians as others. Snow, we hear this a lot. Oftentimes the issues with snow plows and curb extensions doesn't have to do with the fact that they're a curb extension. It has to do with the design of the curb extension. And if you want some great input on this, the Public Works folks up in Ketchum and Haley kind of have this down to a science. But here's some treatments to deal with for that. The top left is Bozeman, Montana. The bottom left is McCall, Idaho, where they do put reflective tubular markers around the outer edge of the curb extension so the plow drivers can see them. It's also important to avoid abrupt edges in this environment because that's where you can get into the concerns of the plow clipping off and doing damage to the curb. The top right is in Sandpoint, where they have put essentially an L-shaped protector in cast iron on the top of their curbs at curb extensions to save that from the chipping that occurs. And if you want to doubt me on the snow stuff, the bottom right is Anchorage, Alaska, and the curb extensions are all over there. And what they've done here is done more of a smoother transition, so you don't have some of those abrupt edges. So there are techniques out there to deal with this effectively. Pedestrian crossing islands, median islands. The top left is here in Boise and is that classic Z crossing that you would see. And you can see how if you cross from the right to the left, you are kind of turning and facing traffic to make the next maneuver. Top right is kind of a traditional one at a mid-block crossing. It's from the Walla Walla area of giving pedestrian that refuge with the rapid flashing beacon, which I'll cover. And the two bottom ones up in Sandpoint, this is what you'll commonly see at a roundabout. This happens to also have the rapid flash beacons on the entry. And then the 18th Avenue project in Lewiston, which if you haven't seen that, some neighborhood traffic circles, some rapid flash beacons, and pedestrian refuge islands. It's a pretty good comprehensive project, especially for a city of that size. So moving on to the entrees, this is where I'll really cover the signal aspects, because this is what you get asked for a lot or we hear things about. And it is one of the things, especially for a full traffic signal, that does have some limitations within what is written in MUTCD to justify the signal. So I'm going to start with the traditional signal, but I'm not going to belabor it a whole lot. It's the hardest to get, but there is more flexibility for school-specific crossings within MUTCD, and this one here on Park Center in Boise shows what that is. In general, and I see this and wish we could get away from this, of 20 students during the highest crossing hour says the signal then can be warranted. That's 20 students or 20 parents of students willing to have them cross with no protection just to justify the signal. And one of the phrases we hear in transportation a lot is, we don't justify a new bridge by the number of people swimming across the river. We make other engineering judgments. And to the credit here, I know we have several in Boise where ACHD has used that engineering judgment to improve conditions around schools. So there is flexibility, but like I said, document why you're doing it. These are generally pretty safe because motorists are used to this typical paradigm of a green, yellow, and red traffic signal, but we do want to look at spacing from other signals, vehicle gaps, and speeds, and considering that. And if you get a crossing like this one in Boise also has a pathway on the other side and is a greenbelt connection. And for somebody like myself, if I'm on a bike and I cross this, I can easily cross it in the 7 seconds or so it has the walk phase, but the drivers are sitting there for a longer time afterwards because we have to follow some minimum timing requirements. And some of that is why some of the flexibility emerged about a decade ago for the other treatments I'm going to cover. And this is the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. It's essentially a crosswalk accent device. And this is where you'll see the flashing yellow lights when a pedestrian pushes the button. It's there for increased visibility or conspicuity to allow the crossing. The flashing lights are generally set at a frequency that we've become used to seeing with emergency service vehicles. And that's part of the theory of why this driver yield behavior rate of 73 to 96% is seen. It reduces crashes, and the cost for about a pair is in the $20,000 or so range. You can get these with solar panels and other things. And obviously, if you're rebuilding curb ramps and things like that, those can go up quite a bit. The one in the middle in Boise really is a great treatment because I think the moment you get beyond 2 lanes of crossing, you need to provide a little bit more. And you can see the mast arm overhead on this particular one. The other 2s are on ITD roads, one in Rathdrum. The one in Filer is a 5-lane road connecting to their middle school that I would say is probably a borderline application for this type of treatment on a road like that, but they do have the Z crossing and other features in there. The top left is from a firm, Carmena Traffic, which was great in buying the patent for the RFB and releasing it for public use. And here's just some other examples. You can see this one on Curling in Boise is used with a curb extension design that puts the medians out there or puts the islands out there and reduces that crossing exposure. This one in Moscow is great in a lot of ways. They even put a short median in there, mainly to help narrow the field of vision for motorists as they come through there and really help slow that traffic down to that desirable speed in a school zone. You can also see in this one, the width of it is 10 feet. And usually that conforms if you're doing a shared use pathway or a pathway connecting to a school, we shouldn't be defaulting to the 4 or 5 foot curb ramp for pedestrians. We should be building one that's the width of the path. When to use them, as I said, generally 3 lanes or less, put a median or a Z crossing if greater. We generally want these on lower speed facilities, 35 miles an hour or less. I would say if you're in that 35, you really need to be checking what's occurring. The flashing time should be set to the MUTCD times for people crossing. It's 3.5 feet per second, but you can slow that down, especially if school zones or a senior center or something like that. And you can't put these in at places that are already controlled by a stop sign or a traffic signal. That might be a request you've gotten from parents is say to put this in at a 4-way stop. These are really meant for other types of uncontrolled intersections. And some other places you see these is some of the slip lanes and on ramps to bar interstates. We have one in Boise here at a couple of right turn slip lanes at Myrtle and Broadway, as well as at Beacon and Park Center. So it's to raise that visibility. Don't pay attention to the maintenance in the one in the bottom right. Those are some things we really need to address from an access and usability standpoint in a lot of different ways. Don't do this. I always say if I can get a great panorama of the mountains and barely capture both rapid flash beacons, we probably shouldn't be doing this treatment alone. The signs tend to be out of the field of vision of the drivers. And this is near Preston school complexes. And so asking kids to cross this is really not the greatest thing. We do have some room on the side with the shoulder to do a curb extension. And we might have room in the middle to do some type of median treatment depending on the characteristics of the turning vehicles at that intersection. In a more urban setting, again, we shouldn't be doing this and expecting kids to cross a 5-lane road with a flashing light way off to the side and really a road that's probably designed for 50 miles an hour or so instead of whatever the posted speed might be. This is where we really need to think about going into that next treatment, and that being a pedestrian hybrid beacon, or what I say is the artist formerly known as a hawk signal. And these are a step up in a lot of different ways. And these are the ones you've seen, if you've seen one, as I push the button for a pedestrian to cross. Sometimes I'll get the signal start flashing yellow immediately. That's a signal for motorists to start slowing down and start watching. The moment I get the walk signal is when the 2 balls or lights on the top go red, and they are solid red for the walk signal duration, and they start flashing red when the countdown begins. That means once they start flashing red, as the sign says, a motorist may stop and then go if the coast is clear. One of the challenges I think is we tend to send mixed messages in a lot of our traffic engineering. The only other place we see flashing red back and forth like you see here is at a railroad crossing. And we're not allowed to come to a stop and then go at a railroad crossing, but some of these were developed kind of using the techniques we had at hand. I would say for this treatment, sometimes maybe the first 1 or 2 in a community is a little bit harder because it's brand new. So it needs to come with education and outreach. But I think as we've seen here in the Boise region, where I think we probably have a per capita installation of these, probably more than any other urbanized area in the country, we're starting to kind of have that point where the drivers are trained. Is it perfect? No, but the compliance seems to be pretty good. And the studies flush this out a little bit. Yield rates are high, crash rates are reduced. These, however, can come with much greater cost. And part of that is because of the signal equipment and the mast arms needed compared to the rapid flash beacon. So the one on the left is on US Highway 91 in Blackfoot, gets you over to the Potato Museum and across the tracks. the 5 Mile one in Boise. And what Caldwell has done on a couple of 2 and 3 lane roads is kind of, they've put the hawk signals in, but have put them on the poles to the side. And that was an attempt to reduce the cost. And they've gotten these down to about the cost of a rapid flash beacon and have put them in a couple of critical areas. I think this one is near the YMCA that's there. Again, on this one, I would watch that flasher and stuff being outside the field of vision. In a school zone, these are generally coupled with some sort of other school zone advanced warning and speed limit reduction for that, and kind of our quintessential walk to school route in Idaho picture that we have going on right there. Another example, this is the one in Blackfoot. You can see the advanced warning for the crossing, but you also see a curb extension ahead at that corner there. So these done in combination with other features just help to heighten what's going on and issues there. So when to use them? Generally, more lanes, more speed is where they tend to be more advantageous. One of the things MUTCD does is it allows these at a lower threshold from a pedestrian volume standpoint, and you have greater flexibility to kind of feel like you can make that engineering judgment versus a full traffic signal. It's best when motorists to come to a complete stop. And so if you're kind of on the fence between a rapid flash beacon and one of these in a school zone, it's best to make the motorist come to a complete stop. The lowest pedestrian volume threshold here is around 20, but again, using that engineering judgment, you can look at things and just be careful with it. The bottom left one is in a construction zone. And this was an application done to help route people around it. This was going to be a place where a hybrid beacon was going to be installed post-construction. So they kind of got half of it in where it's supposed to be, but a pretty good tool to use when you're trying to route people around these and maybe do it in advance of an intersection. Don't do this. And I'll give you a backstory here. This was a full signal on Cloverdale Road here in Boise that was there before the road was widened for kids to cross. And it was converted from a full signal to a pedestrian hybrid beacon, combined with the speed limit being raised from 35 to 40. And the result is this just isn't working. The crossing guards have quit their jobs and they're busing kids from across the street that had formerly walked. So we need to be careful in transitions and thinking about these things, and hopefully a lesson learned here. I don't know that those results would have been fully expected from the beginning. So let's move into the dessert and then we'll get to some questions. And if you want to start pinging them in the chat box for Elizabeth, feel free to do that. Raised crossings. These help raise the profile of pedestrians. They slow motorists down. And especially for people with disabilities, or if you have shared use pathways with bicyclists, this helps show that this is a priority crossing for the most vulnerable road users. Again, I've showed Idaho examples because there are ways to design them and not succumb to the snowplow fears that are out there. The one in Moscow is there at their high school, and the bottom right was just done in Boise in combination with the cycle track around the St. Luke's campus. So there's some other design features you'll see in that one. Twin Falls and Lewiston did these in mid-block locations as well. Twin Falls with their downtown streetscape rebuild, and Lewiston did a lot of infrastructure upgrades and implemented some of these features. So there are good examples in the state. This is one you can see a different profile of the one in Moscow. It's coming down a little bit of a hill. So you can see that apron to the left, and some other factors meant, some other design needs were necessary here, but a pretty good application overall. They need to repaint that crosswalk, obviously. Here's another one. This is in Bend, Oregon at an elementary school coming through an area. It's a curb extension combined with a raised crosswalk just to really narrow that field of vision and slow the drivers and reduce risk for pedestrians. Leading pedestrian intervals. This is where at a traditional signalized intersection, we can kind of give the pedestrian an advanced start. So if I, for example, here am going to Timberline High School as an example, and I push the button on this corner, the walk signal for me will be activated before the green signal for the motorist by a few seconds. This is allow you to enter the crosswalk and increase your visibility. So if we have a situation where we're kind of in that dual threat of a protected permissive crossing and a right-hand turn, we're giving that head start there. Downtown areas are doing this more and more. If you're in downtown Boise, you'll start to see this at some of our intersections, and we've done them at a couple other crossings as well. Flashing yellow arrows. These are becoming more prominent and can be very problematic for pedestrians. The good part is we now have ways and methods to help preempt them when the button is pushed. This is at Milwaukee and Northview and Boise. And prior to some recent changes, this one basically, the flashing yellow arrow allows us to not even give the flashing yellow phase during school walk time. So if you don't have that out there today and you have these, you should be doing that. Another factor that allows you here, as you can see, the red arrow is showing on this one because the push button was pushed and the walk signal is there. And so in those phases where you have a pedestrian who pushes the button, you can preempt that flashing yellow arrow phase in those. And in some cases, maybe you only have that during a peak hour. If it's schools, you might want that to just preempt it for the entire school hour and have it to where it's preempted by push buttons the rest of the day. Other things, speed limit setting, and this is one that's getting a little more prominence. We've often heard that this 85th percentile rule is the only way to set speed limits, and the Federal Highway Administration has endorsed others. And there's a lot of recognition that really the drivers vote with their feet in setting speed limits. And while that might be most applicable on an interstate, we're finding that the research into this doesn't apply to local streets, wasn't considering pedestrian and bicyclist, and the Federal Highway Administration has endorsed the use of another tool called US Limits 2, which is a slightly different methodology and inputs, but talks about the 50th percentile being used to set speed limits when pedestrian safety is expressly a goal. And so if you have school zones or activity areas where there's pedestrian activity outside of school hours, I know a couple of our high schools have activity for a 12 or 14-hour shift, not just in those arrival and departure times, you do have the flexibility to put it through this analysis and have a reasoned judgment to make that call. Why does this matter? If you've been involved in pedestrian safety, you've probably all seen the thing about speed and risk in terms of vulnerability to the human body. The other thing that speed does is it changes the peripheral vision of the motorist. And when you're going faster on the bottom image, your focus is much further down the road versus when you're going slower at 20, you're looking closer. And if you want to think about this, next time you're on one of our 80-mile-an-hour interstates, think about the point down the road that you're fixated upon. And think about the next time you see an unfortunate pedestrian crash of, oh, the pedestrian came out of nowhere. When I hear that, that's usually telling me that the speed conflict is there in these situations. And you can also kind of see with this field of vision how a curb extension can potentially work. Say that vehicle on the right, that Jeep, is a parked car, and pedestrians can start their crossing there versus having to start further back. That's where those come into play. The last thing on speed limits, and we'll stand for some questions, is what if we were to think about alternative speed limits? And we do that a lot in school zones, but we also need to get the corresponding design expectations. But what if we did nighttime speed limits in our downtown areas or areas of high pedestrian concentration? The city of Tucson, Arizona is starting to look at things like this. And based on the premise, well, we do it for this. We reduce speed limits for wildlife. That's obviously to protect the motorist as well as the wildlife, but it's something we can probably think about doing for pedestrians. So that's kind of the quick run through of a lot of these. The last piece I'm going to cover is kind of this lighter, faster, cheaper, or what we call tactical urbanism. And if you've got some of these ideas, find a way to test them out first. We don't want to build a curb extension that feels too punitive to a snowplow, but we shouldn't let that idea go away. On Sherman Avenue and Coeur d'Alene, they've put in temporary curb extensions to reduce the speed limit and test out what's going on, do pre and post studies, look at turning radius. The bottom left is essentially taking yellow 4x4 posts and some of the movable, flexible bollards and tubular markers to create a curb extension. And you can see in the foreground, in the background there, they have a fire truck and they've got people assessing it. And so they want to identify the geometry that works while still having those benefits. And the bottom right is one we worked on in Wallace, Idaho last year on a couple of their main routes coming into town, of just painting them, marking them, mimicking high visibility crosswalks, and then taking the city council on a walk to look at them. And we also did one in American Falls with some similar results. North Dakota DOT, which I bring this up because it's not some wild, kooky, crazy place like Washington State or California doing this. North Dakota is doing this through their DOT in their small towns and cities across their state. And so it's something in trying this out that should not be limited to think about urban areas or big city places. We've got some great examples, and I hope you saw some of those in the images of that. So I think Elizabeth has been tracking questions or things in the chat box, and she can maybe ask a couple of those, and then we can maybe open it up for general questions.
Thanks, Don. That was a great presentation. So one question is, what considerations can you give to bicyclists when providing the neck down mountable apron treatment at crossings? It seems that neck down portion would take over a bike lane.
Yeah, your curb extension should not go into the bike lanes, and you should not be counting the gutter of the curb extension as a bike lane. So that's one piece of don't do that. The other thing you can do for conspicuity's sake is put a reflective post or something out there on those, and we've got some good examples of that. But yes, do not build it out into the bike lane.
All right, and it looks like Cece has some questions about crosswalk widths related to the earlier slides. Cece, if you want to unmute, feel free.
Thank you, Elizabeth. Thank you, Dawn. I appreciate your breadth of experience and awareness of what's going on in the region. So yeah, I'm especially curious about those demonstrations in North Dakota and possibly bringing them to the Wood, or using that example in the Wood River Valley, showing that, you know, not only urban places are doing demonstrations. So I'm trying to learn about the importance of crosswalk width to visibility, because from personal experience, I experience greater safety at crosswalks that are, for me, the width feels like it enhances the visibility. I see in places in the Wood River Valley a crosswalk that is half as narrow as a lane, and yeah, can you speak to that?
Yeah, in general, the minimum width of a crosswalk, in terms of like if I'm looking across the street, not the crossing width, but the width of itself physically is 6 feet. And obviously from a cost perspective, if you've got a shared use pathway, you need to be matching the curb ramp and usually going, if you think of a 4-foot ramp and a 6-foot crosswalk, think of a 10-foot ramp and a 12-foot crosswalk that's there. If I go back to this slide, let's see if it switches. And I don't have an image in here, I should have put one. In places like Bozeman, Montana and Portland, Maine, on these high visibility crosswalks, they are doing a light etching out of the asphalt and then placing the thermoplastic or paint in that. And that is also causing them to last longer in terms of plows not ticking them off. Another treatment, and I think ACHD tends to do it here, is to space the markings in the crosswalks to miss the wheel tracks of vehicles, because once they hit those, that you can see in the bottom left, they start to wear off, and you can almost see in the bottom right the 2 wheel tracks between the markings. So I think if you're looking at the general sphere, there are ways to reduce those, get the wider ones. The bigger concern I see kind of from both a width and application standpoint is the top left. And these start to look the same as the stop bars at an intersection versus the stop bar being in advance of a crosswalk looks very different in a high visibility setting. You can see that in the bottom left there. So I hope that helps.
I'm curious. I see examples of crosswalks, for example, in Boise that overcompensate around the curb and just have more, the area of the markings are greater, the width of the crosswalk is greater. I assume the car sees the crosswalk sooner than a 6-foot crosswalk width. But I'm not finding many and I see opportunities to do that at crosswalks in the Wood River Valley where there is crash data and where kids have been hit on their bikes. But in terms of, bringing that topic to local municipalities who might not want to spend the extra money, and I hear your ways of lowering the maintenance costs with the edging and with aligning the continental or the zebra stripes, whether it be in the continental design or a ladder, but optimally maybe in the continental design so that they're not worn down. I hear your ways of lowering the maintenance costs, but as someone from Safe Routes coming to local municipalities and say like, would you consider widening this crosswalk? They ask why. Would you do that? Would you recommend that? What would you recommend I say?
Yeah, and let me look up and see. I don't recall seeing stuff on like an equivalent of this that looks at width type. So yeah, maybe, and I think I've got your email somewhere along the way. I can do some digging through the Pedestrian and Bicycle Information Center and see if there's anything on that, and maybe it's something that just hasn't been studied a ton. I'm not sure.
Okay, thank you.
So Dawn, what would be your recommendation for one of those designs that you mentioned for a more rural road that's really narrow but has a higher speed of say 50 miles per hour?
I'm sorry, can you restate what that question was?
So what the designs that you mentioned in your presentation, what would you recommend to use for a rural road that's narrow, but the speed limit is still say 50 miles per hour?
Yeah, I think in those situations, you'd want to try to find some design cues that help, narrow that field of vision. There's always the concern of bringing the speed zone down too rapidly and other features. But a lot of places I've seen, and I know a couple, they'll throw a rapid flash beacon out there and there's not much else. And I would really try to maybe do some sort of kind of a mimic a curb extension on that part of the shoulder. Maybe just a raised concrete curbing or something before and after with some other considerations, overhead markers, some advanced warning flashers and other things. But yeah, you're really talking about a very difficult situation there, especially if we're talking about children crossing in that environment.
Thanks, Don. It looks like Lisa had.
Sorry, I would say if you have the ability for a center median or to widen it out a little to get something like that, that would be helpful. But I think in a speed and engineering discussion, you get into some other complexities at that side. Sorry, at that speed.
Yeah, it's like those rural roads can be pretty challenging, especially where there's still agriculture and you have the big ditches on the side.
Yeah.
Lisa had a comment. Lisa, if you want to unmute and kind of speak to that.
Sure. So my favorite thing are the crossing zones with lights in them around schools that are inconsistent. So we have the PHB and then we have the solid reds. And I can think of a couple that I live around sitting here in my house in the North End. And one thing that I continually bring up is the fact that children especially, are motivated by the countdown timer to think, I still have time to cross. And I take issue constantly and on record in a lot of places about the wig-wag and the countdown timer going at the same time. Drivers, yes, are stopping generally, but their glance isn't enough to see a kid running or skateboarding or walking or whatever, biking into that zone with that countdown timer. And I would really want a solid red throughout that whole cycle. I understand the delay in traffic, I suppose, but I also understand children, especially in the school zone, are motivated when they wait for, 60 or 90 seconds for that light to come back on. They're either going to or from school. I don't know. That's just my comment.
Yeah, I would say I'll say a medium, maybe not a happy medium I've seen in that is in timing the signals. The countdown is usually based on a calculation of the width divided by 3.5 feet per second. So if it's 35 feet, it's 10-second countdown. 70 feet, maybe more than norm to think about a 20-second countdown. When you combine the walk and the countdown, you can do a slightly longer one. You can change it up a little bit. And what I'm going after, that one I showed in Blackfoot, essentially, I believe has an extended walk time in exchange for a slightly shorter countdown time. But what that does is it keeps the solid red longer. A lot of places I'll see default to the 7-second minimum walk and then go into the countdown. That one has a much longer walk time. I want to say 15 seconds or so. So just the percentage of people that can get across, because a lot of them in a school zone, if you're not sit there and waiting immediately, you don't get in till the next phase. And I know I've watched that at the Park Center crossing that I had there. So yeah, I wish we had more, I wish we felt we had more flexibility within the stuff in MUTCD to go to full signals at the schools. And like I said, I think we have a couple examples here, but I think we're trying to move more toward Hawks, like in that Cloverdale example, versus keeping the others.
The Cloverdale example is a really great example of what's not working. As a person who serves on the safety busing committee for that particular area, and we've sat and watched that signal, and I guess I would want to say to Cece's point about, we don't want to spend the money. We don't want to spend the extra money, but I want to know, when do we decide to make the road users' lives all equal to each other? And we spend that money in an equal format. We just saw Melissa and Chris Bruntlett do a presentation at the National Bike Summit, and they talked about that decision to make sure that it just is normal to spend money on pedestrian, bike, and driving infrastructure. We're all on the same safety page. Each person's life is as equal as the others. I know I'm talking to the choir here, but that's the kind of thing that that the advocates are shouldered with to continuously bring, and we can't keep doing the same thing over and over without a total breakdown of our own selves, especially at safe routes.
Yeah, and there's a new field of study emerging, and I've used that Cloverdale as an example in citing the research that roads and decisions like that can suppress active transportation activity. So we may look at a road and go, well, there's no bike or ped crashes. Well, we need to look at how the infrastructure itself may be suppressing that. If somebody doesn't feel safe, and the study particularly was done with kids walking to school and parents and allowing them to do that. And I think that one is an example that I hope we can kind of learn from and change the paradigm a little bit going forward. And kind of this thing I say is we design and build roads for motorists that won't exist until 2045, but we struggle to fund crossings for kids that exist today, or activity centers and places. And going back to that other analogy, we have wonderful tools to say we believe that 75 motorists will be turning right in the peak 15 minutes of blah, blah, blah in 2045. Well, how many kids are crossing today? I don't know data. We don't, so that there's some disparity issues in there that I think also work against the better infrastructure investment that I know we'd like to see. Before I forget, I think that Elizabeth, I sent a reference sheet with several online links. I think if you haven't been provided it, you will be, that gets at these particular things. And I wanted to point out a couple in there. One, especially, I don't like the title because I think it could be applicable on a lot of neighborhood streets, and it's the Federal Highway Administration Small Town and Rural Multimodal Networks Guide. And it's a lot of these lower cost treatments, but some higher cost ones. But because it's endorsed by the Federal Highway Administration and it's looking at bicyclist and pedestrian approaches for it, it's a thing meant to give comfort to those that maybe this isn't in ISPWC or some other standard, but it's in FHWA. They combine things from AASHTO and MUTCD to put together the pavement markings and the other treatments, so they might look a little different. And they've also included in there kind of a speed and traffic volume graph to show where some of those treatments are. So pay attention to that one. There's also a brand new tool released. They combine some older documents on road safety audits, but it's specifically prompt lists for pedestrians and bicyclists. And it's the type of thing, it's more nuanced than the walkability checklist, which is a good thing, especially for many of the levels you're at. And it allows you to go out during a design phase, during a construction phase, during a maintenance phase, during a planning phase, and really look at those things through the lens of a safety audit. And what they did in this new document is combine bicyclists and pedestrians into one. They had previously been separate documents. So there's about a dozen or so on there, but I would say those two are ones you might not have heard of or probably haven't seen that I would definitely recommend taking a look through.
Thanks, Don. I'll be sending that out afterwards. Do you have time for one more question?
Yeah.
All right, so do you have any suggestions on convincing a project owner to spend extra money to install anything greater than the minimum requirement by AHJ?
Can you repeat that?
Yeah, so do you have any suggestions on convincing a project owner to spend extra money to install anything greater than the minimum requirements by AHJ?
Some of the things if we're talking about a property owner in a bigger sense, I would say if we need to start looking at putting pedestrian and bicyclist considerations in the traffic study requirements we have for development. The software they're using generally has some metrics in there. Are they the best? Not always, but it puts them on an equal platform. So that would be the piece, and like Lisa said, if for whatever reason the basic safety appeals don't work, it's what are the partnerships, what are the other options we can look toward. What's interesting is most of us have parking minimums and developers and other property owners routinely exceed that. But the moment we ask for a wider ramp or something else or a pedestrian walkway through a parking lot that's protected, all of a sudden we're in crazy mode for that. So I wish I had a great answer other than their willingness, but I would start looking at the degree to which local policies continue to allow those things to happen and not really, as Lisa said, put the modes on equal footing from a safety perspective.